Hey there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back. It's another Red Pill Religion podcast. Red Pill Religion, where amongst the things we say is that religion and politics always go together. They really do. They can't be separated. Often, also, left and right are a shell game. So if you like the kind of content we're doing here, please find us on redpillreligion.com. In these days of social media censorship, we're on our third channel and still being chased around the internet, hoping find a permanent place to stay. You know, we'll always find us on redpillreligion.com. Find our PayPal and our Bitcoin donations. Find our merchandise, which is there on the right. Find us on Subscribestar. We'd love to hear from you. You'll also find us on MeWe, on Gab, on Dissenter. By the way, we strongly endorse and encourage use of Dissenter. It seems to be the only place where there's free speech where you can comment on any article on the internet these days. So we definitely endorse Dissenter. Now, I'm proud to say that joining us again tonight is Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, author of the blog Fencing Barrett Prayer, and also author of Mary and the Art of Prayer, The Hours of the Virgin and Medieval Christian Life and Thought. Say hi to everybody, Professor Brown.
Hi. It's for me, it's evening, so good evening.
Good evening. Good to see you all. Glad you're here. We're probably going to wind up talking about Mary a little bit, but we're probably going to wind up talking more about the history of Christianity, ancient Christianity, what we like to call little or Orthodox Christianity, and why it matters. Also joining us tonight, however, is Apologist Supreme, our friend Josh Brister. Say hello to everybody, Josh.
Hello, Josh. It's good to be here, and I'm really happy.
All right, good to see you. I know you've got a debate planned tomorrow too that'll be right here on this same channel, right? Who are you going up against?
I'm up against Dan Barker. He's a prolific atheist, and I'm looking forward to go against him.
I personally can no longer talk to professional atheists. I've completely run out of patience, and the last time I encountered any, I just got too mean. So we let Josh do that these days.
Yeah, he's been chasing people around Twitter for weeks now, trying to get them to come talk with me. It didn't work. I'm clearly terrifying.
Absolutely. I think they're too scared of you.
Oh, they just know I'm a fencer.
Yeah, there you go. So here's the thing. We've referenced a few books in the low bar. I think most people see these days. I mean, if you're already on what they call the social justice left, probably there's no talking to you on all these issues until you wake up and realize you joined a religious movement that's going nowhere. That's really what social justice, leftism, globalism is doing. A lot of Christians feel very much on the defensive on modern day college campuses. And if you read Rachel Brown's blog, she's a professor at the University of Chicago, and she's gone through quite a bit of academic harassment and censorship, and she's far from the only one. Jordan Peterson, who's not even all that conservative, to be honest with you, certainly has been put through the ringer. He's doing okay, but there's countless other voices in academia and elsewhere experiencing censorship and what some might call the closing of the American mind. That our campuses are no longer free speech zones. We have embraced a culture in which we assume that the ancient religious traditions that defined our culture are old and need to be discarded and dysfunctional and cause nothing but bad in the world. In fact, we've embraced a cultural mentality where being mean to Christians is now standard behavior in university classrooms, and even questionable history that gets taught to students in some of our institutions of higher learning. One of the things that's most concerning about this is that I used to be much in the tradition of what you would call the classical liberal, the old university mentality of tolerance for different points of view, free speech, comparing different religions and finding ways of getting along and that sort of thing. But I think that all stems from the classic historical Christian view of how you approach the world. It's certainly the way the universities were structured. Let me, before I go on, just to give the audience some background. The fact of the matter is a lot of people have been lied to about the history of the Christian religion. which, by the way, you cannot talk much about the history of the Christian religion at all unless you're willing to learn about Catholic Christianity and the various types of Christianity that came out of it. One of the books we definitely would recommend before we go on, I would definitely, if you want to be informed, look for a book called How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization by Thomas E. Woods. You'll find that a lot of the things that you found out about traditional, institutional, organized Christianity there are not correct, especially as it involves the arts, the sciences, and so on. Ditto, a book by James Hannon called God's Philosophers, How the Medieval World Laid the Foundations of Modern Science. A lot of you have been sold the ludicrous notion that Christianity was primitive and anti-science, and it's simply not so. In fact, most would say that the Christian world is the one most favorable to science and to free inquiry, because that's what the religion is all about. Another problem that we see, and this is where I'm going to finish it, and I'm going to open up for further discussion. Another problem that we see is I think everybody here and a number of people are adherents to what might be called Orthodox Christianity in what we might call the little O sense. Your High Church Anglicanism, your even Eastern Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and the various branches that come out of it. These are the organized Christians that, with an institutional history and an institutional memory. And this is a very different type of Christianity than what most people think. Most people seem to think you have a book, a Bible with 66 books in it, you read it, you follow it, and now you're a Christian, if you follow it and you believe in it. And I can honestly tell you that while this shocks many to hear it, this is not how Christianity has been practiced by most Christians around the world for the last couple thousand years. It's simply not. Having recognized authorities and recognized structures is what, and recognized traditions that go back thousands of years is what marks what I'll call, Orthodox type Christianity. We have things like priests and bishops and sacraments, and a little known fact is that the entire university system in Europe was built by the church, either by the Catholics or by certain Protestant or other groups. And they built them under the theory that the university and education was the way to get people to accept the Christian lifestyle by educating them and teaching them in philosophy and the liberal arts and the useful arts and sciences and all that good stuff. And frankly, up to 100 years ago, religious people were still running most of our universities, and now they no longer are. And look what's happened to them.
Okay, that's enough. Can I say something?
That's exactly where I was going to move on. That's exactly where I was going to say, let's move on. Because this is
No, Max, come on. You promised that this time I get to talk. All right.
Let's move on.
No, we don't have to move on. I need to comment on what you've just been saying. Okay, first, don't give up on the SJWs. Bless their hearts, right? The reason that we find as Christians that it's so hard to talk to them is because, in fact, they do have a faith. They don't necessarily recognize it as a faith because, of course, they've been taught in the academy just to think of these things as true. But there's a wonderful book, and we didn't put this on the list, but we can put it on there anyway, by Christian Smith, called The Sacred Project of American Sociology. And I blogged about it a bit, so if you're interested, you can look up in Fencing Bear for you have to search it and find it. Anyway, his argument is that sociology in particular, and the center of the social sciences in the academy, has a sacred project. He says his own colleagues in sociology don't always recognize it as a sacred project, but it has all of the characteristics of something that is in fact salvific. The center of sociology, which is sort of curious if you've been thinking of sociology as about society, is in fact the individual. And the premise of sociology, as it's developed over the last 100 years or so, is to create a society in which the individual can be freest and flourish, right? The problem is that the argument that sociology works from is that the reason the individual is unable to flourish and realize him or herself and the pure individuality that he or she would like to be able to express is because of oppressive social structures, right? And so sociology's sacred project is to figure out a way to break down all of those oppressive structures so as to free the individual. And if you start recognizing that, you realize it's most, and I make a strong argument. All of the problems that we're facing in the West today are heresies of Christianity there, or actually anti-Christian in a way, but one way or another, they're a distortion of the true faith, the true understanding of what Jesus taught and who he was. And this sacred project of sociology is like that, because you're trying to find a way in which the individual can be most fully realized without constraint. Now, what we've learned is, of course, the only way you can achieve that is by shutting everybody up who disagrees with you. And so the social justice warrior problem is, in fact, ultimately a problem of faith. And we as Christians need to figure out better ways to talk to them, because we need to reconvert them to an understanding of the relationship between the individual and society. The second thing you were talking about, no, there was something else. You said like 5 things, and I wanted to respond to all of them. The history of education, we could talk about that. It's true that the universities develop in medieval Europe as places where theology is the queen of the sciences, and where it's the goal to be able to argue that. But it's not. It wasn't directly through the universities that Christians got their primary education in the Middle Ages. That was through preaching, either from the bishops, or once the universities are established, through people like the Franciscans and the Dominicans, who are often trained at the universities to then go out and preach properly. So it's a more complicated relationship than just that the universities were set up to teach people. The universities that we have in the United States, most of the private ones were founded as seminaries, and that's the case. What's interesting, the reason that we don't have proper religious education in the United States anymore is not paradoxically because of secularism taking over. It's because the universities were, I think places like Yale and Princeton and Harvard were in the 19th century trying to come to some sort of gentleman's agreement to stop having all of the confessional arguments that they had. And so, as Stephen Prothero has shown in his Religious Literacy, they made a kind of gentleman's agreement to stop trying, right? And so paradoxically, the reason that we don't have proper religious education in American academia anymore is because the universities stopped. It's not because they were invaded by secularists. It's because they ceded the ground, which therefore means, those of us who would like people to have a true education in Christianity need to step back up and say, no, this is intellectually the wrong way to go. You're going to end up in differences. You're going to end up in arguments. So be it, right? Theology is challenging and complex and takes intense training. That's not a reason to give up.
No.
There was more, but I can't remember. You went on for too many points.
I wanted to set up the main points, which is that Christianity is not the enemy of learning. It is not the enemy of education. Yes. It is not the enemy of science. It has not really been. It has, in fact, been what birthed the modern sciences.
Oh, that was the other thing. Yes. Why we have such a poor understanding of Christian history in the United States in particular, it's because we're Anglophone, and the Anglophone tradition is heavily anti-Catholic. In academia, it's a Protestant narrative, and of course, the Protestant narrative, twinned as it is with science, Newtonian physics and so forth, has since Newton, and before that, certainly, since the Reformation, been heavily anti-Catholic, so that you don't get a full version of the significance of the development of the church prior to the Reformation. And so I
wanted to say something about
that's
this.
Important.
I think.
Go ahead, Josh. Go ahead, Josh.
Sorry, I did not mean to interrupt you, Doctor. Philip.
I was done.
In some of his books has gone up. Philip Jenkins has gone over some of this anti-Catholic bias. A lot of this caricature of theology and science being somehow opposed to each other goes back to an 1896 book by a certain Andrew Dixon White in his A History of the Warfare of science with theology in Christendom. Rodney Stark, one of the scholars that has wrote on this in his book For the Glory of God, demonstrates that this so-called war between religion and science, or more specifically between Christianity and science, is really a caricature and made up by Andrew Dixon White and other scholars based on that anti-Catholic bias that you were talking about.
Yes, and that's so White. I mentioned the sort of self-secularization of the American universities. That White, one of you who's looking at a screen can look this up. He and there's two books that are written around the same time. One of them by the president of Cornell, and I can't remember whether White was he. Yes, it's coming out of those sort of institutional arguments in the late 19th century in American education, and that claim that religion has always been at odds with science is taking a specifically late 19th century definition of what scientific practice ought to be. And it's certainly not representative of, the institutions in the Middle Ages by any means.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to bring up, there's a modern physicist. His name is Paul Davies. Here's what he writes. He says, science began as an outgrowth of theology, and all scientists, whether atheist or theist, accept an essentially theological worldview. And that's Paul Davies in his Are We Alone in 1995.
Yes, I can even speak to that, although I don't want to make this all about science, because I also think that as a society, we need to stop looking to science for all our answers, because it cannot give us all the answers. It really can't. It's impossible. Nevertheless, science rests on certain axioms. As we understand it, the natural sciences rests on certain axioms, among which is that we live in an orderly and logical universe ruled by fixed, unchanging laws, so that the laws of physics are pretty much going to be the same tomorrow as they are today, as they were yesterday. Which, by the way, is not obviously true. We all kind of assume that must be true, but you don't know that. Gravity could change tomorrow. The speed of light could change tomorrow. There's nothing we've got that says that can't happen, except it doesn't appear to. It's a faith-based worldview that science rests on, that any of it works at all, predictably. That said,
yes.
one thing I would push back a little bit on you, Professor, is that while I agree that especially in American universities, the American universities were mostly founded by Protestants of various types, with some Catholic, of course. And it does seem like one of the things that happened over the course of the last, let's call it the last few generations instead of putting it a number, the last couple, 3 generations maybe, is that, yes, what happened, I remember this as a kid too, saying, well, we're not going to be bothering teaching theology or any of that in the universities. Everybody pretty much knows there's a God and they can figure out the rest for themselves. We don't need to educate them on this. But I think that allowed what we would call cultural Marxists to come in and establish their own narrative on religion and fake history, or distorted history, half-sided history, lopsided history, so that especially young people today, it's even in the common culture, but it's in the schools, they will hear bad stories about the history of the Christian religion, especially the organized religion, that are either true, but they're leaving out really important stuff, or that are not true at all. Rodney Stark, who we've mentioned before, wrote an entire book on this. He's not even Catholic, and the book is called False Witness, and he goes in all the things that are simply not true that people think are true, even in academia. He does note that a lot of it is Protestant bias toward Catholics, but a lot of it has just been picked up by cultural Marxists, and to even drive a specifically anti-God, anti-Christ, anti-church, anti-religion message. And
yes, because I mean, it was possible because the universities had already changed their mission, and that is, that's worth knowing. That, I mean, that's what Protero's argument. But I found it very interesting, that we think of the secularization being something that came in and infected the universities, rather than that, as you're describing, it came into a vacuum, right? It was like the universities had decided that they're not going to address theological and metaphysical questions as discussable. I mean, even, what I found very interesting in the last year or so when I've been having these online conversations with people is everybody cares about the metaphysical questions. They want to argue about, the existence of God and morality and, how we understand the faith and how we can prove the premises of the faith. But I've never even heard anybody raise those questions in academia, right? They're just not asked. It's like we put this barrier around the things that it's even permissible to consider as academic questions. And what I learned from Protero is that, that the academy did that to itself, out of, now one of you was supposed to look up whether White was the president of Cornell. Some of it comes out of Unitarianism in the 19th. Yes, it comes out of, and like, I know Henry Adams, who I've written about a little bit, grew up Unitarian. And so you grew up without a discussion of the Trinity. You grow up with, the sort of vague, quote, non-denominational, general belief in something, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you can understand that there's, on the one hand, a kind of theological fatigue in European culture after several hundred years of not being able to convince each other who's the heretic. But on the other hand, once the Christians in the academy stopped exercising themselves in those discussions, why would anybody else be able to do it well? I mean, I have been also frustrated, of course, that the standard of Christian discussion, I found it very high in many of the conversations I've had with Catholics over the last couple of years. But the baseline conversation, as Joshua and I were discovering this past week or so on Twitter, or Joshua introduced it to me on Twitter, is so low. I don't even know where to begin. Right. I think that the best argument
Absolutely.
I saw, I'm reading Edward Fazer's The Last Superstition now, and I think I got it from him, right? That you're arguing with people about God as if you're trying to talk to a 3-year-old about Titian, and the 3-year-old can just think that painting has something to do with fingers and smearing things on the paper. That is the typical level of theological discussion we're in. When Aquinas, it took him 10 volumes of deep systematic argument to even get to the point where he realized he still hadn't expressed it all, right? It was still inadequate to encapsulate what he was given a glimpse of in whatever mystical experience he had. So we're literally not even crippled, right? We're toddlers trying to use a 10-word vocabulary to talk about something that we don't even have enough words for in the English language.
I think that another thing that,
I do think, yeah.
Go ahead, Josh.
Well, thank you very much. I wanted to say in the recent weeks and so forth, when I've gotten to know you, I have seen a lot of these, simplistic caricatures of what Christianity actually is. And I think what they get a lot of this from is it probably dates back, I would say, about 12 years with the rise of the new atheism. That's one of the reasons why we initially wanted to challenge some of these atheists to dialogues and so forth. Go ahead. You can go ahead, Max.
Okay, go ahead, Rachel.
Okay, we're getting better at this. So thanks to Joshua's invitation, which I realized I'd never really thought through the apologetic problem, right? Because as far as I recognize, what I've recognized in the last few weeks is I just have faith, right? What a gift. That it's very hard for me to conceive of not believing in God. So that first exercise, right? So I've been reading around. I was reading Phaser. I've read a bit of E. Michael Jones now. He seems to be the person that a lot of people on the internet are talking about. And I was reading an essay that he did on the New Atheists, about 2-3 years ago. It's part of his big Logos project. So he's talking about the place of the Logos in the world tradition, not just in the West. And he has a progression, which I found very interesting, from the sexual revolution of the 60s, which is a sort of this breakdown of morality and this, the breakdown, as he would put it, of recognition of the natural law, right? That sex is the telos of sex is for children. And if you bring in birth control, you disrupt that telos. You make it about, personal pleasure as opposed to procreating, bringing children into the world, which then leads in the 70s, 60s and 70s to divorce, which then leads to fatherless families, which then in his sort of genealogy of these ripple on effects led to the new atheists. And he says, very interesting when you look at the atheists and their lifetime, often difficult problems with their fathers, or their fathers aren't there or something, so that you have no sort of psychological model of what it is to understand God, which we could think about, right, as sort of the patriarchy problem. But it's interesting, without a father, it becomes very difficult to understand what it means to be able to have someone who is both loving and authoritative, ideally. And that in his version, it's the new atheism of the 2005 or thereabouts that led directly to this explosion of political correctness. And that was, in fact, that was to me the first truly persuasive version. I mean, the cultural Marxism thing, I think it's an element of it, but the reason that the new atheists were so popular was, in his version, because people had this sort of chaos that they didn't know how to think about God anymore, and that the only way you can enforce, social behavior under those circumstances is then this political correctness that we're all living through.
Yes.
And it's, as we recognize it, very oppressive because people are terrified.
Yes.
You're correct.
Well, I think a lot of that's because for all too long, people have gotten a watered down version of Christianity and don't know how to defend it. They don't know the long historical tradition from the Middle Ages, and up through historical eras. They do not understand what apologetics is. That's why I think it's so important that we help and confront culture with history and try to argue against many of these myths that are still around in our culture today.
What I'd like to say is that this can be demonstrated easily with the best of sources. The new atheism was specifically a project to attack Christianity among young people. That's totally what it was. You can reference, I have multiple books I can give you on that. I'd start with Professor Borden Painter's book, The New Atheist Denial of History. But I think that beyond that,
I did get that, Max. I've been reading it.
I pray that you get a chance to. It's written in very good academic and dry academic style, because once you absorb that book, you realize it was a planned propaganda campaign. It totally was, and I'll stand that up to anybody or any source. It was a planned propaganda campaign to miseducate the public and to create hatred of Christianity. That's what the purpose of it was. That said, I think the other flip side of it is that Christians, even if you're not going to become Catholic, although I would really like you to, if you're already a Christian, I think the other problem is lack of respect and knowledge about the ancient Orthodox traditions of the religion. I mean, because it was all that. Friends of mine who are Eastern Orthodox, because Eastern Orthodoxy is becoming very popular here in the West and in the United States again, they refer to this as Romophobia. And it comes out of that English-speaking world, Anglophone world, Protestant tradition of anti-Catholicism. But it is starting to bite us on the butt, because the truth of the matter is organized institutional Christianity, the kind with formalized prayers, the kind with sacraments, the kind that sees the saints in heaven as alive with us, and people we can ask to pray for us. That is the Christianity that is the most sophisticated and it's what birthed the modern world.
Right, but we'll never get them that way. right? And that's, again, the Twitter experiment for me was very interesting because, I mean, Josh invited a few people in, and then I argued with them for a day or so. And, you realize that, indeed, you're arguing with the 3-year-olds who can finger paint. And they're saying things like, there was one guy who's very persistent, saying, the sky fairy. Faith in the sky fairy, yay! And the best thing to do is say, yes, I believe in the sky fairy. So there, what are you going to do about it? But the sort of prove God exists, your God exists, and then prove that it's the true God. To get people at that level of arguing deeply, as you're suggesting, Max, about the long tradition, they're never going to listen. Right. So we need to figure out, Twitter level strategies. I recognize this. I think it's quite serious. We need to figure out Twitter level strategies to get people just listening at all. And if some of you listening may know, I'm very good friends with Milo. That is why Milo is so important, right? That one of the things, Milo just released a song this week, Silver and Gold. He's doing the gospel song. And what he recognizes is, the only way you're going to get people back into the church is singing, right? You need to have the joy and the music, but it has to work on both of those levels in order to get people to listen to you at all. And there needs to be something substantive in those moments of gripping them to get them to listen. And that's what I think we really should talk about. Stop throwing books at them, right? You guys clearly, we all read, right? We've just referenced more books than people are going to read. Most people listening to this are going to read in a year. Yep. So how do we get the people who say your sky fairy murders children to listen to us? And I that was very interesting for me, because that one guy, I kept making jokes about them because they all had dogs and stuff, and like, you're a dog, and they're like, who are prove your humanity? And he's like, well, how do you know I'm not a dog? And I'm like, well, I don't know, your picture is a dog. That that is the marketplace where we start, right? St. Francis knew how to do this, right? He went and threw off his clothes in the middle of the plaza and said, I'm God's. We could try that.
Well, here's another suggestion. I've been doing a lot of research into the study of the imagination, and the Lord of the Rings, J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, with the imagination. If we can somehow communicate the usefulness of the imagination to some of these new atheist types, then I think we'll start to see some signs of improvement, so to speak. I just had a conversation with a great Australian philosopher, and probably the foremost atheistic philosopher in Australia, or perhaps in the world. His name is Dr. Graham Alpy. Dr. Graham Alpy, I could tell by talking to him, he doesn't buy into a lot of these new atheist type arguments. These are a caricature of what Christianity really is. So I think when you go into the detail, you might see the devil is in the detail, and they're not really taking this academically seriously.
Right. But thus far, we've said nothing that will convince anybody, right? So we need to figure out what we say to help convince people, right? And one argument that was in Dr. Jones's article that I was looking at was a sort of arguments about primitive religion, which I was a little skeptical as well, because I'd think, well, he's arguing that there's a giant study that he references that says, look, primitive religions tend to have sky fairies, that it's in fact primitive to recognize the creator God and to, see that God in some way related to the sun or some way related to the sky, and that it's only decadent. Polytheism is actually decadent, right? And I'm like, okay, one, that sounds nice, because then it makes, Christianity the truer and original faith. The problem is I'm immediately, as a historian, skeptical of exactly how you gather those sorts of stories. How do you tell which one's oldest? How do you tell what primitive people actually believe? I've also been reading, here we go again with references, some of Christopher Hallpike's works on, can you be good without God, and The Ship of Fools, where he's talking through the anthropology. Arguing from primitive religion is very complicated, because the people who went and collected the stories from the quote, primitive people, were themselves already expecting to find certain kinds of religion, right? So does it progress from monotheism? Does it decline from a pure primitive monotheism that everybody human seems to recognize until they get corrupted by civilization? Or, is polytheism the default, where, you've got gods of all the different little springs and mountains and winds and stuff like that, and then monotheism is the higher progressive development? We're already in trouble.
Well, let me talk for a little bit here, Josh, okay? Because I want to basically answer the question. By the way, I think monotheism comes before polytheism, because there's a monotheist idea in most sophisticated polytheist religions.
Yes.
I think people start. We have this in research too, showing that between the ages of about 2 and 4, around the same time as language development, most children develop a basic idea that, like, there's a God, there's something running everything. That's actually a normal. The ancients called it the sensus divinatus. Modern science shows that it's still there in most kids, except for a certain number of autistics and a lot of abused boys. That said, I find that we're in a culture, a fatherless culture, a crass culture, a vulgar culture, which, by the way, Milo, since you've mentioned him, speaks to that crass vulgar culture very well. This is why some traditional Catholics are not quite getting it. Why he's able to get through to people otherwise. And the truth is, in the vulgar culture, the graffiti culture, the chanter culture, which is the graffiti culture of the internet today, you know what works best? Mockery and savagery. I'm sorry, but it does. And what I find is
Sky Fairy. I believe in the Sky Fairy. There you go. Throw it back at them, right? The Twitter people were desperately trying to get me to say, I don't believe in a Sky Fairy. It's much more complicated than that. What Milo would do, and what you need to do, is say, own it, right? Fine. I believe in a Sky Fairy who gives me a moral law by which I live.
That's right. This is a point John Wright and I have made. John C. Wright, we do a regular thing, and it's like, you know what? Honestly, and this is a way of both mockery and of making a point. Honestly, if you worship Thag, the spider god from Missouri, you probably are a person with a better sense of integrity and honor, at least. And we know what you're all about, because you worship Thag, the spider god from Missouri. We know something about you. When you declare yourself totally atheist, you declare yourself above it all, and you declare yourself the ultimate moral arbiter of everything.
Right.
Same thing goes, by the way, with pompous Bible Christians whose primary mode of evangelization seems to be slagging off on the Catholic Church, which is a way of slagging off on most of Christianity throughout the last few thousand years. And it is worth mocking them too, because that type of Christian is not above the same thing. Mocking Catholics, mocking traditional religion, mocking or disparaging organized religion. And I'm sorry.
Right. That I see, to me, that feels defensive on our part, right? And that's, again, what Milo does, right? It's like you're never on the defensive. You're always on the joyful offensive.
Yes.
It's sort of
that approach.
Joyful offensive. How's that? That and the other way I think of it is sort of improv theater, where if you're in a Keith Johnston, more references, talks about some exercises that he does with his actors to play different dramas, right? And one of the great exercises he has is playing high status, low status, which is interesting. But there's also that improv rule, basically, when you're brainstorming about something in the improv moment, someone suggests something and you say yes, right? Because if you say no, the scene goes nowhere, right? So someone says, you worship a Sky Fairy, and I say, yes, I do. And then there's something else, right, that can happen. Whereas if you're like, no, I don't, it shuts it down. So there's I think, stop worrying about defending organized religion. We'll never get them that way. Going for, well, do you believe such and such? Well, yes. And then they're listening because they didn't expect you to say that, right? It's puzzling. Now they're curious and they want you to say a little more.
Well, I think my mockery, truly, I've gotten some of my best exercise from going back and forth with atheists, just because atheists read the Bible in a savagely stupid, primitive, literalist fashion on purpose.
Mock away.
I mock them, and then I see primitive Bible Christians attacking the Eucharist, attacking Our Lady, attacking any of them, I mock them too. And it really is important. Oh, you mean you're one of those
And you keep getting banned too, Max. Come on.
I know. Well, I have been banned many places. I have deserved it at least one time. I admit it. I deserved it at least one time, but mostly I haven't. It's mostly I mean, I had a bunch of stuff that was caused that I posted on Atheist Republic's Facebook page, and they eventually just quietly muted me, so I can't post there anymore because that's the way that is. But it's the same way with Bible Christians, you know. Oh, you think mighty King James is going to save you? No, only Jesus can do that, son. Which is a tart line, but it gets attention. Oh, your sliced up, cut up 66-book Bible where you don't even know who the Mother of God is? Yeah, I don't want your religion.
Okay, that is not going to persuade them. That is not arguing with love. The reason you can mock the atheists, and I think you can't mock the Bible Christians in the same way, is the atheists are mocking out of the claim to reason, right? Whereas the Bible Christians are mocking out of a claim to faith. And so I think we need different strategies.
Well, here was one of my strategies. When I was debating with Dr. Graham Oppie a few days ago, I noticed he was a brilliant thinker when it came to philosophy. But when you take him out of their narrow, ways of their narrow understandings and their specialties, then, like, for example, I'm a history teacher, then they kind of have more difficulty. A while ago, we were arguing about whether the earliest gods were monotheistic or polytheistic. And a scholar by the name of William Smith in 1880 and 1890 and 1900, he really showed that the earliest civilizations did believe in high gods. So, at least high gods, if not full out monotheistic gods. So I think just as there's a progression of science, why can't we have a progression of theology where God is working in the historical process? Of course, all this would get past the new atheist types. What say you, Dr.?
So I think it was Schmidt that Jones was referencing. Yes, so that's the same argument about the monotheism being the sort of primitive default.
Yes.
I definitely think that matters, but again, I'm just going to push back a little bit because we're here to talk. One of the groups that I spend a lot of time on Facebook, I'll even flash it and suggest people join me there, Protestant, Orthodox, and Catholic Discourse. It's a great group, and we spend a lot of time in there, except one of the things that continually happens, and not just the Eastern Orthodox that are in there, but even some Protestants have complained, that basically every other post is from a Bible Christian talking about how the Catholic Church lies. And
okay, so we need to figure out how to counter that. That's important.
It really is, because even though I want you to be Catholic with me, I want everybody to be Catholic with me. And then if you don't like the Pope right now, that's okay. A lot of Catholics don't like him. We're not required to. But if you're not, at least learn to respect it, because honestly, people with Bibles in their hands and loudly stated opinions ruin discourse with Lutherans and Presbyterians and Methodists and Anglicans. And so I do think a sort of tart, well, so you've got a Bible and an opinion. You think that makes you a legitimate Christian. That might seem harsh, but these guys use that same kind of rhetoric. They actually are often like arguing with an atheist. And I think
right, but I do think it's so one's arguing from what they think is the superiority of their reason, and the other is arguing from what they think is the superiority of their faith.
Okay.
Right? So we need to so mocking helps with those who are arguing from what they think is the superiority of their reason, because you're showing that they're being irrational, right? It's very hard to argue with someone when we want to argue on the, for revelation with someone who is arguing that, well, the Bible is revealed, and therefore if I'm reading it, it must give me access to the faith. Right. And I think is why it's it's been a harder challenge for Catholics because, we recognize the revelation, but we also recognize the tradition of interpretation that we're talking within, and showing Bible Christians that they are actually working within a tradition of interpretation. That's the challenge, right? It's because they don't want to think they are.
Right. They don't want to think they're in a tradition, but they are. Well, maybe pungency isn't the best approach, or maybe some of us will be pungent and some will not. But I do think if the general populace is to get at least a respect, not even to come to the faith, although I'd like that a lot, not even to come to the faith and say, I respect this. I understand that these people have a learned, thoughtful, stable tradition that a lot of my society's values are based on. And they aren't all Fred Phelps screaming screaming with a Bible in his hand about how everything's going to hell.
But that's part of a tradition too. I mean, I think maybe this is it. Maybe you start with this. I have many, good grief. This is probably the most reference heavy podcast ever. David Hackett Fisher's Albion Seed is an excellent account of the different folkways. He calls them folkways, cultures that came with the four main English-British groups of settlers to North America. The Puritans in New England, the Anglicans in Virginia, the Quakers in Pennsylvania, the Midlands, and the Scots-Irish Presbyterians in Appalachia and further west. And saying I grew up Presbyterian, I didn't appreciate what that actually meant, because Presbyterians now are sort of mainline and stayed, right? Mm-hmm. But I have this sort of fiery willingness to fight everybody, and I'm like, where did that come from? And I'm reading Fisher, and he's describing the way, Presbyterian preachers used to be really like fiery, and they in fact invented the camp meeting, right? That they come to, first the colonies and then the United States from, borderland Scotland, Northern Ireland, and so forth. And they are the ones who had this like impassioned style of, come to Jesus preaching. So recognize that as in fact part of the American tradition and start there, right? Joyously recognize that people are wanting to read the Bible and wanting to come to Jesus. And the televangelists, as far as I can tell, the Baptists seem to take over this camp meeting style from the Presbyterians.
Yep.
And that is, it's sort of endearing, right? It's this wonderful sense of the gospel is something to be preached to everyone. So you do that, right? You need to lower yourself as Christ did into our common language, into the sermo humilis, to use the technical happy Latin term, of our ordinary speech, right? That's what we need to practice as Christians, as Catholics, right? Rather than saying, oh, well, it's all super sophisticated and you don't get it because you're not listening, right? You need to practice. This is the Marian miracle stories that I've written some about in my book. The collectors in the Middle Ages would always say these are for the simple, and everybody's, oh, they're for the folk religion, they're fairy tales. I'm like, well, yes, because that's what Christians do. We speak not as the wise, but as the common, the ordinary, right? We need to learn to speak to everyone.
That's right. That's right. And the only thing I would say is I came out of a tradition like that, and I recognize what you're saying. I've heard some wonderful, fiery, brilliant sermons out of Baptists, even though the Baptist religion is almost polar opposite of mine. They obviously have gifts there, and that's one that other Christians need to pick up: the ability to get up there and with fire and ice and sarcasm and irony and go ahead and get people get offended. People got offended by Jesus too. I think that as a lot of, especially the older line Christian denominations, especially the Catholics, just got to get over, I call it the wussification of the church, not even just the feminization, the wussification. People unwilling to just stand up and let people be offended. Let women be offended.
Yes.
Let anyone be offended, especially let women be offended, actually.
Let them be offended. And that's why I've been writing about Milo, right? It's like, so, we're still celebrating the 2-year anniversary. So Trump made his executive order, which is a direct response to what happened at Berkeley with Milo's talk 2 years ago, that Milo was willing to play the holy fool, right? He was willing to, that's what his silver and gold song is about, this that he released this week, that it's gospel, it's, black gospel, and it's I'd rather have Jesus than silver and gold. And in the video that he posted with all of his fabulous clothes and his expensive dinners and his vast audiences of cheering fans and stuff, and he's saying, but that is not what matters, right? That he's been willing persistently to get up there and be humiliated and be ridiculed and made fun of and play the fool, because that's what Jesus did. That's what Francis did. I did a post called "Holy, Fools for God," right? And talking about Francis, not only did he strip his clothes off in the middle of the plaza, and when he was telling his father, "Fine, take them. You're not, I'm going to live for God now." He also did various things, like when he showed up to have an audience with the Pope, and the Pope said something like, "Who's this filthy person that I don't want to talk to?" And Francis went and rolled in the mud. You have to be willing to be humbled if you want people to be able to see Christ.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why I also think that a lot of people are missing the boat on people like Milo. The vulgar culture is vulgar. And what is the root of the word of the Vulgate, the standard Catholic Bible in the West for thousands of years? It was called the Vulgate because it was made for the common people to read it. The vulgar people. That's what the vulgar people was. And the vulgar people use words, use potty mouth that a lot of good Christians don't like. And vulgar people call BS on things and get snotty and sarcastic sometimes. And they joke and they laugh and they play games with head games as to who can beat who. And you have to be able to get in that environment. I actually really regret that Milo stopped making fun of atheists, because he was doing that for a while. He should go back to it.
Why do you assume he stopped?
Oh, I just haven't. Maybe I've just missed it. He was doing it a lot at one point, and then I haven't heard him doing it a lot lately. But maybe I'm wrong. I'll stand corrected if he's been doing a lot.
Be patient. Be patient.
I will be patient. Well, you know how much garbage I've gotten from other Catholics, Ted Schubat and others, just for defending Milo. It's the way it goes. But he's got the key. Even if you're listening and you're saying, no, we can't be like him because his lifestyle is all wrong and blah blah blah. Fine. Look at what he's doing that's right. Right. And emulate what's right while disparaging what's wrong, and pray for him. By the way, we do need to get wrapping this up. We're coming up close on the hour mark, and we don't want to go past that. Go ahead, Josh, if you have something you want to say.
Oh, yes. I wanted to say, I wanted to focus on the imagination again. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says, Christians, no matter if they're Protestant, if they're Catholics or Anglicans or Orthodoxy or what have you, they can, they can find Christ. They are to come to Christ in humility and with an open mind. And how to defeat the SJW culture, I think we have to come at them in a united front. Jonathan Haidt, the philosopher and psychologist Jonathan Haidt, he wrote a book recently called The Coddling of the American Mind. And it shows that many of our students, the young people, get really offended and need safe spaces, and so to speak, by not being able to argue. And I think the new atheism and the cultural Marxism has really been detrimental to our culture. And if we want to fight for culture and bring or stand up for how we got to today, just as Edmund Burke, that late 18th century British would said and defended, we have to stand up for our values. We can't just wait passively by and let everybody tramp all over them. I would really like to hear your opinion, Dr. Brown.
So I said I'm reading Ed Fazer too, the last superstition, and he said specifically values is the wrong word. We should talk about the good, because values are subjective, and the good is real, right? And that matters. To answer it, I think joy is the primary thing that we should carry, right? That you go into all of these discussions with joy, because what we want to do is share the joy that we have of knowing that our Creator loves us, that He loved us so much that He entered into His own creation and became humbled with us, that we have to be willing to be laughed at, and to take that not as something. I mean, people, shame is our primary like mode of existence right now. We're going to shame you on social media by calling you names and make you feel humiliated or stupid. I mean, that the atheist and the Twitter discussion that we had were constantly trying to shame me. Well, you're a
Yes.
professor. How are you so smart? And that's a stupid argument. And it's like, and every single time they did that, I'm like, okay, that's the best they have, which is to try to make me, stand up and try to say, well, I'm a professor and I know more than you do. The only time I did in that exchange, if you recognize, is I finally was saying, look, well, read this, read this, read this. And this guy was coming back at me and saying, well, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, you haven't done the reading. How can we have a conversation? And but that I never pulled rank, right? Because pulling rank is anti-Christian in a sense, right? Because you never know what your true status is. The last shall be first and the first shall be last. But that you can't do it with rank, right? You cannot, as a Christian, persuade simply by saying you have authority. By earthly credentials, never hold it, right? So we have to be willing to be considered foolish by the world in order to witness to the joy and the knowledge that we've been given through the revelation of the scriptures, and also through the worship that we participate in, that we are creatures of a loving God.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And that's a good note to close on, actually. I'll close with a Bible verse, which we don't do too often here, but Matthew chapter 5, verses 11 through 12. Blessed are you when people abuse you and persecute you and speak all kinds of calumny against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven. This is how they persecuted the prophets before you. That's right. And I'm sorry, people, but there is a God. And it's really not deniable. You can only deny it by screaming, "There's no evidence," over and over again. Or show me the evidence. There's a God. If you want to talk about it, you want to learn about it. Learn about it. And if you want to be a Christian, you don't get to just pick up a Bible. You have to learn and accept some instruction with some humility. But exactly as Professor Brown just said, there's great joy in it. My life has been nothing but enhanced by my relationship with my personal relationship with Jesus Christ, which I have through his mother and through the Holy Eucharist. And these things are ancient and they matter. And frankly, I think they're the only thing that's going to save this civilization. Those of you who want to save Western civilization, you need to save traditional, Orthodox, yes, even Catholic Christianity. Fair enough? Anybody got a final word they want to get out?
Hail Mary.
Hail Mary.
Well, I do want to say, as a history teacher, I'm so thankful for leaders like you, Dr. Brown. Please continue to stand up for Christianity against the modern SJW. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right. So tomorrow night, again, we're going to have, Josh is going to be having his debate on the channel. On Monday, we'll be back here with my fellow former atheist, science fiction author and lawyer, John C. Wright. We're here more or less every night. Please check out Fencing Bear at Prayer, Rachel Fulton Brown's blog, which we have linked in the low bar. Please also check out her book, Mary and the Art of Prayer, The Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thought. You Christians, by the way, who don't like Mary ought to at least learn how to appreciate her and why other Christians don't agree with you. So in the meantime, we're always here on Red Pill Religion. Check us out on redpillreligion.com. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, hit that notification bell, tell your friends or enemies, and Ave Maria, everybody.